In early 2024, something happened that wrestling fans thought was impossible. The man who had controlled and built professional wrestling for 4 decades had stepped away. The reason? Well, it was a lawsuit containing disturbing allegations. The man at the centre of it all was Vince McMahon. For years, Vince McMahon seemed untouchable. He created the biggest wrestling empire the world had ever seen. It was worth billions, and it still is. It created global superstars, and the controversy in 2024 wasn't even the first controversy that we'd seen. It was far from it. If you go back through WWE's history, you'll find something surprising. A whole list of scandals that stretch back decades, pretty much from when the WWE first started. There was government investigations, there was backstage betrayals, there was strange accidents, there was tragedies that shocked the whole wrestling world, there was moments that changed careers, there was destroyed reputations, and sometimes lives ended. And when you start connecting those moments together, a much darker story about professional wrestling starts to reveal itself. The first massive controversial story surrounding Vince McMahon exploded in the 1990s. At the time, WWF wrestlers almost looked superhuman. They had huge muscles, they had huge physiques, they looked like the bodies were unobtainable through natural means. In 1993, the US government accused Vince McMahon of distributing gear to wrestlers. If convicted, he could face years in prison. And suddenly the future of WWF looked uncertain. Former wrestlers testified in court, doctors testified, and the entire future of wrestling was uncertain because the whole industry was under intense scrutiny. For weeks, trials dominated headlines, but in 1994, the jury had reached a verdict and Vince McMahon was found not guilty. To many fans, it looked as if the controversy was actually over and finished. But only a few years later, another moment would change the wrestling world forever. In 1997, Bret Hart was preparing to leave the company. He was going to a rival promotion company and he'd signed a deal with them. But there was a problem because Bret Hart was one of the belt holders. He was the champion. And Vince McMahon didn't want him taking that belt to another rival company. So Bret had agreed to lose the championship eventually. But he refuses to lose it in Canada because he doesn't want to lose it in his hometown, in front of his home crowd. Vince McMahon disagreed. And behind the scenes, a secret plan was divulged. During the Survivor Series, the referee suddenly called for the bell. Even though Bret Hart had not submitted, he'd just lost the championship without even agreeing to it. Fans immediately realised that something was wrong. The arena erupted in chaos. Hart confronted Vince McMahon backstage, and then a situation exploded, and apparently Hart had knocked Vince McMahon unconscious in the locker room, but the moment became known as the Montreal Screwjob. That was one of the biggest moments in wrestling that we'd seen so far, but strangely enough, the scandal had made Vince McMahon more powerful. It had made him into a big character. It created storylines for him. It created the fans' ruthless boss, and the fans loved it. And only 2 years later, something far worse had happened. In 1999, during a live wrestling event, Owen Hart was meant to make a dramatic entrance from the arena rafters, and what was supposed to be a dramatic stunt failed, and Owen Hart fell 70 feet into the ring, and the accident happened during a live broadcast. Hart later passed away from his injuries, and the tragedy shocked the wrestling world, but what happened next became extremely controversial. The show continued. Even after the accident, the show continued, and many fans and critics were outraged because the incident led to lawsuits and it led to debates about the safety within the WWE. And for many people, it remains one of the most darkest moments in WWE history. But just a few years later, another wrestler would face another massive tragedy, one even more disturbing than that one. In 2007, the wrestling industry was shaken by a story. Chris Benoit was one of WWE's most respected performers, but over one horrifying weekend, everything had changed. Authorities discovered that Benoit had unalived his wife and young son before unaliving himself. The news shocked fans everywhere, and the tragedy raised deeper questions. It spoke about the toll of physical wrestling and the immense pressure it took on your body. Medical experts later examined Benoit's brain and found that the damage to his brain was consistent with repeated traumas to the head. And now the darker side of wrestling was being spoke about across the globe. WWE found itself again at the centre of that controversy. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, WWE heavily leaned into shock factor. Storylines became more extreme, segments pushed boundaries, and controversy often drove ratings. Some moments later faced heavy criticism. During a storyline that involved Vince McMahon, Stratus was placed into a humiliating storyline that fans later described as degrading, but at the time it was presented as entertainment. But years later it became part of a wider discussion about how women were presented within that era of wrestling. Moments like this looked at shock value as opposed to anything else that really mattered. Everything was about shock in that era of wrestling, and sometimes the most bizarre moments weren't even scripted at all within the WWE. In 2005, during the Royal Rumble, something really unexpected happened. Two wrestlers were eliminated at the same time, leaving fans to wonder who had won. So Vince McMahon came storming into the ring, and upon coming down to the ring and climbing into the ring, he tore his quads. So he was sat in a chair in the ring just while the show continued because he couldn't move, and he just stayed there. But years later, the controversies surrounding Vince McMahon became much more serious. In 2022, reports surfaced that Vince McMahon had paid millions in settlements to former employees. The payments were reported to be in relation to workplace relationships and misconduct, and the total reportedly was around 12 million that was paid out. The story spread across major news outlets, and WWE's board investigated, and for the first time in decades, Vince McMahon stepped down as CEO of the WWE. Many people actually believed that Vince McMahon's era in the WWE is finished, but the biggest controversy was still to come. In early 2024, another lawsuit surfaced containing disturbing allegations made by a WWE former employee. One of the names that came about was Brock Lesnar, because she'd accused Vince McMahon of sharing images and videos to Brock and offering her services to help Brock secure another deal with the WWE. The story spread across global media, and sponsors reacted, fans demanded answers, and suddenly the man who had controlled professional wrestling for 40 years was in the biggest crisis of his life, because for the first time Vince McMahon's future looked uncertain. So just to conclude, there's no denying what Vince McMahon actually accomplished with the WWE. He transformed wrestling into a global entertainment industry, created some of the biggest stars in sports entertainment. He created a company that's worth billions. But alongside that success, there's just been constant controversy, and as more details continue to emerge, Vince's legacy is starting to be brought into question and disrepute. The debate surrounding Vince McMahon's legacy continues. Was he a visionary businessman, or was he one of the most controversial figures in entertainment history? The answer's kind of still unfolding, and we'll just have to see what comes out over the next few years, if anything at all does come out. So thank you very much for watching this video. It's been quite difficult to make. I could have easily rambled on for an hour. Thank you for the new subscribers that have subscribed to the channel. Yeah, if you did enjoy the video, like the video or subscribe to the channel. Thank you.